future. For those joining us, there is translation, simultaneous translation in Arabic. If you click down below at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that option. Also, if you have any questions for the discussion, please feel free to include them, and there'll be time for questions and answer at the end of the session today. I'm Nader Kibani. I'm a senior fellow and director of research with the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. And what brings us here today is really the occasion of World Refugee Day. The Middle East and North Africa region continues to have the highest proportion of refugees and internally displaced persons in the world, exceeding 4% of its population. Conflict continues in Iran, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, and there's a financial crisis in Lebanon that has crippled the economy. Financial crises are also looming over other countries of the region. The escalating conflict in Sudan has the potential to be the most devastating of all. All of these various crises and conflicts have contributed to a successive waves of refugees over the past decade, seeking safety and a new life in other countries. Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey have shouldered the greatest burden of refugees in the region. And many actors working on these issues are concerned about the challenges that refugees will face in the coming year. The escalating conflict in Sudan particularly has the potential to, being the country with one of the largest populations in the region, has potential to spill over into neighboring countries and really increase the refugee crisis by an order of magnitude. Also, the instability that Syria continues to face creates instability for refugees seeking to return home or under pressure to return home. And that's especially without a political settlement and lack of support for reconstruction funding and dwindling donor support that continues to impede the ability of refugees to rebuild their lives. Joining us today for a conversation on this very important topic are our esteemed panelists. Fuad is Associate Professor of Public Health Practice at the American University Beirut and Associate Fellow at the Islam Faris Institute at the UB. Mirza Korma is the Director of the Middle East Program at the Wilson Center. And Reva Dingra is Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Brookings Institution. So welcome all to our discussion today. And I'd like to begin with kind of looking at discussing the overall situation facing refugees in the region. So I'd like to begin, Mirza, with you. What, in your sense, is the overall state of affairs regarding refugees, their socioeconomic conditions, and the difficulties they are facing, especially minority marginalized populations among refugees?
Thank you so much, Nader, and thanks to both the Islam Faris Institute and the Middle East Council for this very timely panel. I think suffice it to say at the beginning that the state of refugees in the region is really tragic, with more than 15 million refugees in the MENA region, particularly with the Syrian refugee crisis entering its 13th year. It still is considered one of the largest displacement crises in the world. I think at this point, the refugee situation, of course, we have multiple refugee populations, from the Palestinian refugee population to the Iraqi refugee population, the Syrian refugee population, as well as you mentioned, Nader, in your comments earlier, refugees due to the conflict in Libya and Yemen, and most recently in Sudan. I'm going to zoom into sort of some of the highlights with a particular focus on the Syrian refugee crisis. I think to start off, given the various global disruptions and global developments that we've witnessed over the last few years only, from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine in particular, things have deteriorated on the ground significantly. The attention on the refugee populations in the Middle East and North Africa region have really shifted to Europe since the outset of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Currently, many of the refugees in the region experience economic hardships, particularly because food and fuel prices have risen significantly. Of course, a lot of this is due to the fact that, for the internally displaced in particular, they are in conflict areas. Those who have fled and are refugees in host countries have had to deal with COVID-19 and inflation, but also from Lebanon to Jordan to Turkey. These countries have varying economic difficulties, but nevertheless, they do have their own economic issues to grapple with, from high unemployment to, as you mentioned earlier, debt and financial crises. And in the case of Turkey, also sluggish economic growth and very high inflation. Just to give you a sense of where we're at, and I will throw some data and then talk a little bit more about the sociopolitical factors. So in Lebanon, which according to, per capita is the top refugee host country, 9 out of 10 refugee households live in extreme poverty. And in Iraq, more than 3/4 of those internally displaced who basically are outside of camps have also very high levels of accumulated debt. And so it's very difficult for them to get adequate accommodation, to purchase food. There are so many different negative coping food strategies that they have to tend to. Of course, children attending school becomes less and less of a priority for them. We're seeing an increase in child labor, and of course, receiving healthcare. In Jordan, it's the same situation with regards to high debt. Many of the refugees have to borrow from friends or neighbors. And then with the high unemployment rate in the country, many of them are primarily in the informal economy, and that comes with its challenges. And we've seen that particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, now we're seeing the impact of that. So in general, the poverty rate is over 70% for most refugees in the region. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is aggravated by what the host countries are experiencing themselves. The other sort of side of the coin when it comes to the status or the conditions of refugees is the sociopolitical conditions. So in most cases, you have a very sort of a fraction of the refugee population that is registered officially with UNHCR. In Jordan, those Syrians who live in Zaatari and Azraq and other smaller camps represent about 25% of the refugee population, with the vast majority living in urban centers amongst host communities. And so that creates a lot of tensions, particularly when there are economic and financial hardships that host communities are experiencing themselves due to the plethora of crises and pressures that many of the host countries have experienced. The sociopolitical dimension in Lebanon is very acute. It is, unfortunately, one of the things that many politicians, many political leaders, but also many people in general agree on. For those NGOs working on the ground that help refugees or support programs for refugees, they try to keep very low key because it is highly politicized, and sentiments vis-a-vis refugees are pretty negative. And then lastly, when it comes to Turkey, we've just witnessed, of course, in addition to the public sentiment, which has been sort of growing more and more anti-refugee, we've seen how the refugee issue was an extremely controversial and negative topic in the presidential and parliamentary elections. And so I think that sums it up. I will leave it with one last thought, which is, there is donor fatigue in the international community because a lot of these conflicts are protracted. And with the attention shifting elsewhere, primarily in Europe with the Ukraine conflict, there is this sense that the refugee populations in the region are abandoned. I think there is a challenge for UNHCR and other UN agencies, as well as NGOs working on the ground, to raise enough funds for just basic services. I know the World Food Program in Jordan, for example, had to constantly assess and reassess or do vulnerability assessments in order to support the most vulnerable families, because support was dwindling. So those are all issues that I'm more than happy to discuss further with my fellow panelists. But I think that pretty much paints the picture as we see it today in the region for refugee populations, but also the internally displaced. Over to you.
Thank you, Marissa. No, thank you so much. So, I mean, really, the situation facing refugees is becoming more dire, and as you mentioned, effectively, you know, the countries hosting them have now competing priorities, both internally and in terms of these protracted long-term refugee situations and donor fatigue. All these coming together. Reva, turning to you, I mean, how are neighboring countries managing these trade-offs in terms of their policies? How are they trying to balance? How are they managing to balance these competing priorities and still play host to refugees?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Nader. And Marissa really laid out a very grim picture of the situation facing refugees in neighboring countries. And as you noted, these countries are grappling with macroeconomic challenges, the effects of the pandemic, the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the effects of currency inflation, and domestic governance issues that have led to broken economies in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. Each of these countries is grappling with issues in private sector growth, as well as state management of the economy. And these are not necessarily refugees' fault. These are not refugees' fault, I would say clearly, but when you have the compounded effect of hosting an additional population, I think some of these states tend to scapegoat the refugee populations for some of these factors. So I'll turn to the question of how these countries are currently dealing with the refugee populations, the Syrian refugee populations, and I'll focus on Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, which are each the main hosting countries for Syrian refugees in the region. And what you see is a sharp variation in policies between Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon in terms of what labor rights, what access to services they give to refugees, and the recent policies of arbitrary deportations, which are all tied together in affecting the socioeconomic status of refugees, the socioeconomic inclusion of refugees, and how refugees see their future in these countries, which I know we'll talk about later in the discussion. So I'll start with Lebanon, which is fitting because this is being co-hosted by IFI, and what we see in Lebanon is, as Marissa mentioned, a very dire economic situation. And since the start of the refugee presence, we've seen a relatively higher level of hostility towards Syrian refugees because of sociopolitical factors, because of the history with Syria, and you see a sort of reticence based on public opinion, based on perceptions of the burden that refugees are putting on the economy, which are real, but also it's a product of mismanagement. And especially in recent weeks, we've seen and months, we've seen an escalation in arbitrary deportations. First, it was for Syrians who weren't registered, which the Lebanese government stopped registering refugees in 2016. So this is a pretty huge population of Syrians that would fall under this. And what this has done, and now it's broadened out to refugees who do have registration. And what we see here is the effect of these policies is pushing people into the shadows. It's people afraid to leave their homes. It's people who are afraid to go to work, to participate economically. And, you know, beyond the limited access to the labor market, that's pushed people into the informal economy, which depresses wages for both, you know, Lebanese workers and Syrian workers. Not letting people register for work permits is a net negative for everyone. But it also has created this deep environment of fear. And then in Turkey, we see the effects of, you know, the election rhetoric. We saw a government that was previously very pro-refugee in a way, that, you know, despite restrictions on mobility, so Syrian refugees were limited to working in the province of their registration. Many refugees did not, you know, follow that. People would migrate to Istanbul or to other major cities, you know, to work there. But the escalating anti-refugee rhetoric by politicians and among the public has also, I would say, created this environment of fear for refugees who are facing, you know, harassment at the workplace, who are also grappling with, you know, the economic situation in the country. And ultimately, what this is doing is compounding the problems that refugees are facing. And then finally, I'll turn to Jordan. I don't want to go on for too long, but I'll just turn to Jordan. And, you know, even Jordan, which has positioned itself as this sort of island of stability in the Middle East, which has been a darling of Western donors, has, you know, imposed or put forward various programs to facilitate the entry of Syrian refugees into the labor market. Even in Jordan, you know, we see cases of arbitrary deportations. Syrian refugees are limited to specific sectors of the economy, which, you know, is justified by the government as a result of the broader unemployment situation. And I want to make this point, and I'm sure we'll all discuss it, but Jordan itself is also a leader of normalization efforts with the Syrian regime, which has, you know, created, again, this environment of fear for Syrian refugees that, you know, more deportations, more returns are in the future. And the impact of this will be, and has been, pushing people into the shadows. And I think, you know, we're seeing a situation where these countries are dealing with very real issues in terms of the economic pressures of dwindling aid, of you know, an additional population, but also ineffective policy making that is you know, not letting us build on the potential that refugees have to offer different economic, different local economies and the societies.
Thank you so much, Reva, and for highlighting the fact that even though all these neighboring countries do face, you know, they face different levels of essentially economic pressures and different conditions, but you know, these are reflected in even though the policies are similar in terms of some arbitrary deportations, reduced opportunities for work opportunities for refugees, and other factors. There's a big difference in terms of how these are manifested across different countries, depending on their situations. Turning to you, Fuad, actually, a couple of points building on that. I mean, Lebanon is a bit unique in that it is host to a large refugee population, especially as a share of its own population, at the same time facing its own financial crisis, which has essentially crippled the economy. That's independent of the refugee situation, but has led to competition, let's say, over scarce jobs and over scarce resources to be more acute than some of the other countries of the region. And you're based in Lebanon. One question is, how do you see this? And do you want to maybe go a little bit deeper into how this is being played out in the country? And the second is an issue that was raised briefly by Marissa and Reba, but isn't maybe getting as much attention, which is internally displaced populations in the region, which actually outnumber refugees across the region, and they face their own circumstances and quite different in terms of what they're facing. But how are they faring and are they missing from this conversation, and how they can be brought in? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nad.
I have an echo here. You hear me now? Okay, so again, thank you very much, Nader, for inviting me to join this great panel, and I thank you, Hassan Faris, also Institute. I just want to add something about the issue of, I'm here in my capacity also as a chair of forced displacement program in Middle East at AUB. This is a program funded by IDRC. And listening to Marissa and Reva, I mean, very interesting issues around the issue of refugees. But I would like here to start answering your second part, because always I feel that when we start thinking about displacement, forced displacement, the first issue to jump to our mind is refugee and refugees. And we're here because of World Refugee Day. And 90% of the fund all around the world goes to addressing refugees' needs. And all these issues, the entire discourse globally is about refugees, though, as you've mentioned, almost like a 60% of forced displaced population, as per UNHCR, are IDPs. And well, so what happened with those people? Why we don't pay enough attention, even in academia? My main research actually on refugees, not on IDPs. And I think there is an issue here behind that. And I will try to address or answer this concern from three issues. One is about numbers, about that. Second is about the issue of definition and legality. And third, about the issue of responsibility. And that could be the main issue, that why the focus on refugees more than, IDPs. As per UNHCR, and I will read this quote from UNHCR. They said, even if they have fled for similar reasons as refugees, IDPs remain under the protection of their own governments. This is a core issue when thinking about responsibility. The definition of IDPs is that those who didn't cross the international border. That means they are inside their, national border. But what about those cross the power lines or power borders, And this is not just a situation in Northern Syria, which is a big example. This situation now in Sudan, this situation in Yemen, this situation in many parts of the world. Those who cross the power borders, but didn't cross the international, then they stuck in a situation that's now, just recently, we start calling that limited statehood entities, which is, I don't think there's a sort of statehood, structure in Northern Syria. It's sort of just non-state entities. In terms of numbers, we're talking about, as you mentioned, 60% of forced displacement in the entire world. And for Syrians, the number is 6.8 as per UNHCR. And this number, if we look to the time frame since 10 years, this number is almost the same since 2015, when we reach the peak of IDPs. And still we have the same number, since that time. So people didn't go back, even after having after set the issue of armed conflicts. So they didn't go back. So why, and what are reasons behind this, and what does it mean? What that tell us? All these issues are important to understand, even if we want to understand the bigger picture about displacement and refugee in specific. The third issue about IDPs I also need to mention is the responsibility. As UNHCR mentioned, this is the responsibility of government, but at the same time, the governments in general, and Syrian government, they said they are, not in the under the government controlled area. And we saw that clearly during the earthquake issues. You know what happened, I mean, you all know that. So what happened, the earthquake that in southern Turkey and northern Syria, exactly where the 5 million IDPs are there, that the Syrian government didn't allow, the humanitarian aid to go through the national border, because they said they want to do that through the government control, through the Assad regime. So they didn't, at least for the first 3 days, they didn't allow, humanitarian aid to go through. And actually that made a lot of issues, even from other side of Turkey. They also, the cross border from Turkey to Syria was, a bit delayed at that time. So it was big example, because what is the governance model there in northern Syria? Up till now, it's like a non-state actors, NGOs and international NGOs that functioning and trying to provide services, but this model is not sustainable. This model lacks a lot of issues, basic issues to do so, even though we don't have enough answers about, what this big group of population need to address. The last issue before I stop here is about this multi-displacement. Those people, in a recent study, I'm also quoting here that 9 out of 10 IDPs or Syrian IDPs in northern Syria were displaced again after the earthquake. So 9 out of 10. And of those 9, they moved sometimes up to 12 times, inside the countries, crossing different, not just power borders, but also, sort of more safe areas. So the whole issue actually is about IDPs is out of thinking, out of control, and out of unfortunately funding and addressing their needs. I will stop here and back to your first question later when talking about the second round, hopefully. Thank you, Ned.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fuad. And for bringing attention to the issue of IDPs who often get lost in the conversations, and the example of northern Syria, and the fact of, like you said, 3 days no aid coming in from either side, and essentially being left feeling all alone, and that kind of reflects kind of the hopelessness many do feel, and linking that to the wider issue of refugees is something really we need to consider as we move on to the next round of questions. I'd like to kind of turn to now kind of a little bit looking to the future. What is happening. So Marissa, turning back to you, we discussed how there are essentially new evolving crises, for example, in Sudan, prolonged conflict, which with new dimensions to them, including now pressures to return in the case of Syria, and at the same time shifting donor priorities, both in terms of the Ukraine refugee situation, as well as potentially economic pressures that donor countries are facing. So maybe fewer resources in the future. What are we looking at in terms of the future? How are these pressures going to manifest themselves in the context of refugees and internally displaced populations?
Thank you, Nader. I wish I had a I guess like a magic wand to just sort of cast a spell on all of these multiple challenges in the region. It is a very uncertain future, precisely because of the new geopolitical shifts that we have witnessed in the region. So, both Reva and Fuad talked about how the earthquake was pretty much the Assad regime's excuse to sort of get back into the region and a little bit in the international community, of course, not in the same way. As we've noted earlier, many countries in the region have also taken the lead to slowly bring Syria back in the fold for various reasons. So it's been welcomed back to the Arab League. Now, what does normalization with the Assad regime look like is still something that is evolving. And I think that, on the technical level, there have been all these committees set up that involve representatives from each country in the region, but particularly the neighbors and some of the GCC leaders, primarily Saudi Arabia, that really took the lead on this in order to move this process forward. Now, for countries like Lebanon and Jordan, the refugee issue is high on their priority list in order to address, because there's an economic economic pressures, but also because there are political pressures as well. And so the only way moving forward is for these issues to be addressed to be addressed by the host governments. The missing piece from this formula is sort of Western government intervention or a role for the West to sort of navigate a lot of these issues, because the West, particularly the United States, and it's one of the largest donors to UNHCR and to host countries like Jordan in particular, will sort of do the bare minimum in this regard, but they certainly are not going to open up a line or line of communication with the Assad regime to be part of coming up with a lot of these policies. It's pretty much the region that said, or the regional leaders that said, we're going to take matters into our own hands and move forward with this. That is the worry. The worry is that these, you talked about competing priorities, is that, their national interests are going to trump everything else. And so the policies are not going to take into consideration any humanitarian aspect of the crisis. Reva talked about arbitrary deportations. And even when the voluntary and coordinated sort of returns are happening with UNHCR, those are still in coordination with the Assad regime, where lists of individuals are basically sent over. And the other dimension of this is that Syria is grappling with its own economics challenges as well. And so the return of all these refugees, for those who want to return and actually have a place to go back to, is not necessarily a priority for the Assad regime. So there are so many, challenges moving forward on all of these issues. And, Fuad talked about the IDPs, and I guess rethinking, and this is on the international community level, rethinking a lot of these approaches, going back to the definitions that were basically set in, early 1950s and like later on updated, like, maybe a decade or two later. We live in a completely different a global order. I know that we've also, we have no legal definition for climate change refugees, for example. So there are so many steps that have to be taken at the international level in order to address some of these challenges. And I think with the big global players, primarily the United States, in taking the lead on the conversation when it comes to these issues. The worry is that, beyond the numbers that have crossed the border, you have the natural growth phenomenon. I mean, in the Zaatari refugee camp only, 3 out of 5 women are getting pregnant annually. And so the birth rates are extremely high. the child population is almost at 50%. And there's a whole generation that was born in a refugee camp in a host country that they do not have any, or necessarily have any affiliation to, and to an identity that they cannot really understand, because they were not born in Syria and do not have that connection. And so there are so many different components to it. And I think the first task is to try to identify some of the steps necessary that the regional governments, but also the international community have to take in order to first, you still have to address the humanitarian component, and then you have to address the developmental component, because you do need to create jobs, you do need to create income generating projects, and then you have the more sort of highly politicized policies with regards to return, integration. And so it's a multi-layered issue. I think the future is uncertain, but part of the onus at this point is also on the international community to look back and say, these refugee populations, these IDPs are not forgotten, that the conversation has to happen. And if need be, pressure has to be exerted where things need to move forward in a particular direction to protect human lives, and not just move forward with policies because it serves the national interest. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Marissa. And I think we'll come back in a second, another round of questions to the last point that you made, where what needs to happen, what kind of pressures need to be brought to bear, and discussions need to have that international level, given these new realities. But I'd like to turn to Reva I think we had a lot of ideas here to unpack that Marissa laid on the table, including kind of the changing nature of refugees, where in the case of and definitions that were put in place half a century ago, changing pressures. I also know that the average duration of conflict has increased substantially from around 13 years to hitting closer to 20 years now as an average. And so all this goes back to the idea of prolonged conflict. And that means prolonged refugee status, and issues of identity, issues of people who are displaced, the next generation who doesn't feel like they belong. Lots of issues to unpack here. Turning to anything that you want to pick up from what that Lisa put on the table, as well as what's happening in terms of looking at the changing attitudes towards refugees, given all these. Countries now. Also look at, countries that were willing to maybe accept certain international agreements 50 years ago, when these issues weren't as big, maybe much more reluctant to accept their responsibilities today. And you can see that playing out. So how do all these changing factors and attitudes play out going forward?
Yeah, Nader, thank you. There's really so much to unpack there and answer. So I'll focus on Marissa's point that our definitions need to change, that the nature of displacement has changed, and we can see parallels. Unfortunately, the situation of Syrians is not unique. We see it in the case of Palestinians. We see it in the case of refugees from Afghanistan displaced in Iran and Pakistan, many of whom have been displaced for decades and don't have the same access to the labor market, don't have the levels of international support that other refugee populations get. And what we've seen in recent years, for example, in Pakistan, is refugees being offered a voluntary incentive to return to Afghanistan, and then when the situation deteriorates again, being trapped at the borders. And we very much risk a similar situation in Syria without a political solution, without a concerted effort at stability, at making sure that the environment is safe and economically stable for refugees to return to. This is just not any returns will simply compound potential human rights abuses and further challenges that we'll face in, a few years. We can't simply return refugees because we decide the conflict is over, if, the actual conditions haven't changed in order to facilitate that process. And it's very much reflected in the attitudes of refugees towards this situation, the attitudes of Syrian refugees towards return. So in the latest UNHCR survey on perceptions of intention to return, only about 1% of refugees, Syrian refugees surveyed, said that they intended to return to Syria within the next 12 months. And only a quarter of refugees, less than a quarter of refugees said that they intended to return within the next 5 years. And this is amid deepening discrimination in host countries, worsening economic situations, and even amid normalization campaigns. These surveys were done in January and February, so obviously things have changed quite a bit since then. We don't know what a similar survey run today would say, but even then normalization efforts were happening, and refugees are still saying again and again that they don't want to return to Syria because the conditions in Syria are not safe. They're not economically viable for people to return to. The housing situation and public service situation is really dire. So, for example, Turkey has announced this plan, or Erdogan has campaigned on this plan of returning 1 million refugees to northern Syria by collaborating with the government of Qatar to construct housing in northern Syria. But 2 million people in northern Syria already were living in tents. So the housing isn't even going to be enough for the people who are already there, the IDPs who are already in tented settlements and informal camps and formal camps in northwestern Syria. So building that additional housing, with all the destruction from the earthquake and the already unhoused population, is not going to substantially change the housing situation for refugees to have really an incentive to return. And what we are seeing shifts in, and this is something that we need to talk about, especially from a Western perspective, is these escalating economic crises in neighboring countries. The escalating anti-refugee rhetoric isn't leading to more refugees wanting to return. It's actually leading to more refugees wanting to migrate to third destination countries. And this is a trend that we see in survey data every year. That percentage has gone up, even as the deadliness of routes has increased, even as the stories of, for example, the boat sinking in the Mediterranean last week had a number of Syrian refugees from Daraa in the boat, and people are still willing to risk their lives on these journeys rather than return to Syria, and in cases are actually newly fleeing from Syria itself as well. So we're clearly in a situation that is fundamentally broken in terms of refugees are not being included in neighboring countries. The conditions aren't being established for them to safely return, and they're being turned away at Western borders. And we see this being echoed in for example, the case of Sudan, which I'm sure we'll talk about soon. So Egypt has effectively closed the border to Sudanese refugees trying to flee from Sudan to the north. It's imposed heavy visa restrictions, particularly on men. And there are approximately 100,000 individuals trapped at the border between Sudan and Egypt. And these visa restrictions, are a testament to the fact that I can't guess at what exactly they fear, but I would assume that it's a similar fear of that once you welcome refugees, there's not going to be enough support, and they're going to be there for a very long time. And I think you see more and more, as you mentioned in your question, more and more countries will refuse to fulfill obligations under international law if they view that as the case, and if, for example, the EU gave Egypt 80 million euros for border management, but only 20 million for supporting Sudanese refugee needs. So if you see this mismatch from, a Western donor's perspective as well.
Thank you, and I think, for putting this into kind of a succinct framework in terms of what refugees are facing, returning is very difficult given the opportunities and the security considerations. Staying is difficult, and humanitarian issues are extremely difficult in these camps, as well as like a future. And moving to other countries is being blocked. So we turning to the please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. A couple of questions are already around this point, and around the series of what can be done. Where do refugees go from here? What are some of the possible ideas? And one other question that another person asked about, which is very interesting, is what about statelessness? To what extent is that? It's already been an issue in the past, but now it's probably increasing, given that people are are being born outside their home country, and what does this mean for them? Both in terms of how they feel, as well as actual tangible documents to allow them to travel. Turning to you, Fuad, for some guidance and clarity on this.
Well, thank you, Nader. I mean, too many difficult questions, and I think Marissa and Reva put the whole issue in what I think could be in a different direction of the panel itself. I mean, we're talking about uncertainty. I think given the past, given what we know and what we knew about this issue, I think we're a bit certain that the situation will stay and still very, very difficult. And this is for me a certain. First, there's no return. There's no near return. Whether we're talking about the issue of voluntary return, Reva mentioned that only 1% showed that they want to go back. And, almost quarter, they said, not in a plan. And even if we have it like this survey as sort of just an open eye, so it means that nothing in the near future about return. Second, we don't have, as scholars, as people working in this field, we don't have any example, any sort of concrete example about a big crisis in the past that people return. I mean, you mentioned that that's the average length now of displacement crossing, to my knowledge, is crossing 26 years, and we have many examples, especially in Middle East, but all around the world, of, decades of displacement. And we know also from UNHCR that the number in 2013, first time I moved to Lebanon, start working on refugees and displacement, the number of overall for displacement globally was 40 million. Now it's 117 million. So it's up and up and up in a sort of exponential, numbers. So on what to return we're talking about, on what policies we're talking about. I mean, I think these are, now back to your difficult question, what to be done. For me, I think we need to revisit the entire issue from the beginning. Cannot, I mean, again, the durable solution by UN agencies, are talking about, local integration, resettlement and the issue of repatriation. Well, if we examine these three issues, none of them actually is easy to do. No one accepts to have like a local integration, and even become more and more, though it is a de facto. Syrians in Lebanon, will stay there for I don't know how long. The Palestinians in Lebanon now 7 decades. You're talking about Afghanis in Iran, or Pakistan. It's a decade of displacement, and with no integration, with no real integration. Up till now, Syrians in Lebanon are allowed to work only in 3 domains. Construction, farming, agriculture, and street cleaning. So what about those million that want to go to schools and want to have something? Second is, this resettlement become less and less actually available. And that's why people throwing themselves in the Mediterranean and not just risking that, they know that they go to die in such a number. And return is also is not an available solution. So what to do? That's why we need to rethink about the entire issue from the beginning. The responsibilities of international communities. This is a very important issue. Redefining is not like a sort of an intellectual exercise. We need to know this is very important to have a sort of to allocate responsibilities. Who's responsible for that? What about, I mean, we're talking about the consequences. What about the root causes? You know, after all these issues, you know, what happened in the Middle East with the consequences of all these devastating wars, they allow the Sudanese example to come back again, you know, before the war erupted, you know, in the last, month or few months, you know, we thought that things could be okay in Sudan. They could find their way to have, you know, future. Then, I mean, regional actors and international actors, you know, let it go, let it, you know, have this war. And it's not a surprise to have, you know, a million displaced now in Sudan. Without also considering these root causes of the displacement, we will not reach any sort of a durable solution. We need to have all this process itself, you know, under a deep revision and need to allocate responsibilities, you know, and it's not just about funding. It's not just about, you know, the issue of hosting. It's not, you know, I mean, can you imagine that, you know, it's not, you know, we always speak about 6 million refugees in 3 countries, but Marissa mentioned clearly about, you know, we're talking about the growth rate. People, I mean, after 10 years or 13 years, you know, it's a normal, it's not surprise to see that we have like a 200,000 newly born babies, and that could address the question about stateless, you know. So yes, some of them are stateless, you know, they don't have place to go back, they don't have place to resettle, and they are not legally integrated. So what does it mean? Those will end up to be a stateless. This is everything. That's why I'm arguing that we're certain about this. We're not uncertain. We're certain about the situation. We're certain about what could happen. What we're uncertain about is what to do if we just keep doing that, the whole issue again and again. I will stop here. Hopefully can answer something later. Thank you,
Fuad. So, I mean, let's start with the couple of things that are on the table still. One is the issue of what to do about the current situation. The other is what's happening in Sudan, a country of 45 million people, so larger than other conflict countries in the region, 19 major ethnic groups, and neighboring countries that have their own problems. What lessons do we have for that? How can the international community approach the issue of the evolving situation in Sudan differently based on what we've learned so far? Looking at one or two of the questions as well is what new ways of potentially what additional resources can be brought to bear? Can other countries be involved? Are there other modalities? Are there other solutions that go beyond the usual approach to supporting refugees and internally displaced persons that can be brought to bear? Marissa?
Thanks, Nader. And I also wanted to address some of the comments that both Reva and Fuad highlighted with regards to, well, you know, we've seen this before, particularly, you know, going back to Fuad's point, why is the international community letting this happen? And you know, going back to your question of what are the next steps and what to do. I mean, the fear, you know, Fuad talked about the certainties, right? That this, you know, returns are not going to happen, political solution is nowhere to be seen, et cetera, et cetera. But the fear is that as these, you know, as the economic situation deteriorates, as the sociopolitical dimension of refugees and IDPs in their locales also worsens with time, we're going to see other entities, groups also emerge on the ground. And I just want to remind everybody that whilst, the international community and, the anti-ISIS coalition declared victory over ISIS because, yes, they've lost the territory, but all the reports about ISIS from, intel to scholarly and etc., are basically indicating that there is a resurgence and that there are sleeper cells across the region. And the fear is that all of these different challenges are going to be compounded and explode, and only then will we see another intervention, not militarily, but sort of like more engagement with the region. Sort of the view for many people in the West is that, well, things are kind of, yes, there are skirmishes, yes, there are cycles of violence in different pockets, but it is largely, stable. And for many policymakers, that is enough. And only when the crisis erupts into a more serious, conflict, will we see more engagement or re-engagement in the region. And that is very unfortunate, but that is very much likely the scenario that we're looking at. And I don't want to, of course, mix up refugees with threats of violent extremism. But of course, when we're looking at, multiple challenges facing a family, a community, a whole, entity, over time, we're bound to see, other sort of challenges that shoot off of these economic and political hardships, from increased crime to, we're already seeing increased, child labor, increased, surges in child marriage rates. And then once a lot of these groups start, reorganizing, then you will see a whole new dimension to basically extremist groups taking charge. So it is a very unfortunate situation, but it's I think important to highlight that we don't have to wait for a crisis like this to erupt in order for the international community to re-engage. And yes, Fuad, you're absolutely right. The definitions and redefinitions is an intellectual exercise, but it is also something that has to happen in order for the different approaches to also be adapted to the reality on the ground. We've seen this happen a little bit with UNHCR when they started shifting from just pure humanitarian to more developmental approaches, given the longevity of a lot of these conflicts. And finally, when it comes to resources and, sort of sharing the responsibility, and I saw that there was a question about, well, what is the GCC doing? The GCC countries have provided financial assistance to UNHCR and their own, other sort of projects here and there, but have not formally sort of hosted Syrian refugees. And they have their own set of, I guess, from their perspective, challenges. They are also geographically removed from a lot of these, from basically, a lot of these conflicts. And we've seen, these sort of tectonic shifts in the region redefine relations in the region, with Syria, but also the roles that they played either supporting or de-supporting various groups, whether it's in Syria, Sudan, Libya, and Yemen. And of course, it's not just the Arab countries, but it's very much about Iran and, with the most recent rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia that very much focused on Yemen. So again, because the perception in the region is that amongst governments and regional leaders is that the United States in particular, and thus the West, is a little bit more sort of disengaged and has withdrawn, it is probably an opportune time to sort of re-engage and ensure that beyond what is already happening, that there has to be more engagement in order to prevent these crises from erupting into more serious conflicts.
Thank you, Marissa. So Reva, Marissa kind of highlighted especially this idea that it's important to engage early before things get out of hand. I think this also aligns with a couple of the more recent strategies that the World Bank, IMF, and others have introduced, is the importance of actually prevention or getting involved early on before crises emerge. I'd like to turn to the most recent question in the Q&A, which is talking about the Caesar Law. If you want to see it, but the idea that are there policies that Western countries or other countries have put in place that let's say made sense at the time, but may be barriers to helping refugees resettle, rebuild their lives, or are inadvertently contributing to the situation because they were put in place in a different context and now they need to be changed, but it's difficult to change them because of inertia or public sentiment or other ideas. Is there something, so that builds on kind of Marissa's point about reacting, what do you do about things that are already in place that could be changed to help alleviate the situation of refugees?
Yeah, so Nader, I'll address that question from the Q&A, and then I do want to piggyback onto some of Marissa's points on more engagement and the sort of prevention approach before a crisis starts on the Caesar Act, and I would say on the question of sanctions. More broadly, I think that, this really came into play, the rhetoric around this came into play during the earthquake response. We saw, the Syrian government saying repeatedly that, sanctions were what was preventing assistance from getting to earthquake affected communities, even as it was keeping the border closed to northwestern Syria in the first days of the crisis. And this question around sanctions has been debated, quite extensively. And I think there are very different perspectives on this. The provisions of the Caesar Act do target individuals more specifically. They're a more targeted sanctions package than I think the broader than people think. But at the same time, there's overcompliance among financial institutions. There's overcompliance, in terms of transferring funding to communities that need it inside Syria. So this is less about refugees and more about the inside Syria financial situation. And after the earthquake, the U.S. government did issue clarification on humanitarian exemptions for sanctions in terms of assistance for communities. So I think, also the debate on sanctions needs to take place in the context of massive amounts of aid theft by the Assad government. And this is something that will continue to be a challenge in rebuilding and reconstruction efforts, is the sheer level of aid theft, of aid diversion, of numerous reported stories from the WHO, from other reconstruction funding, where also, the currency exchange laws, where you have reports by different Syrian civil society organizations that document, the level of, monetary manipulation, as well as the actual aid diversion itself that's happening inside Syria, will be a serious challenge to rebuilding, along with, some of the effects of sanctions policy and overcompliance on that front. So I think that, of course, will be, an inhibitor to rebuilding infrastructure, to building services, but it's also the question of how do you do that effectively when you have a sort of predatory state that cares more about, meeting the needs of its allies and its specific populations rather than meeting the needs and rebuilding and creating a stronger economy and environment of safety for its population more broadly. And then, on the policy questions and sort of what to do and a prevention approach before crises happen, unfortunately, we're already in that. We already see higher levels of crossings from the central Mediterranean routes. The profile of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants have changed. So Syrians are not the biggest population anymore that are going through that central Mediterranean route, but Syrians are still looking very much so looking for different pathways out of the region right now. Particularly, you saw, 2 years ago with the Belarus corridor opening and many Syrians in Jordan, for example, flying to Belarus to go through the Belarus-Poland border. And this is, the EU in particular has treated the simple act of migration as a crisis. The simple act of people trying to flee to safety, to better lives, to protection from discriminatory policies as a crisis. So we're actually already there in many ways. And what unfortunately many governments have demonstrated is that they're more willing to fund containment efforts rather than long-term investments in economic stability, in protection mechanisms. And the EU, Brussels hosted the pledging conference for Syria last week, and you did see sort of billions of dollars being pledged for Syrians in the region, but unfortunately it's A, not enough given the level of needs, and B, the type of aid and our whole approach to aid within this system is deeply flawed, in that we're still using the same or many of the similar short-term funding approaches. There's been progress on that front, thankfully, over the past years, but we've seen long-term programs such as the EU Madad Fund being closed that have the longer-term approach to supporting communities. We've seen things like the Jordan Compact sort of sputter in terms of the implementation, though in 2021 they actually issued the most work permits of any year. So what I would say is there really needs to be a redoubling of efforts towards longer term investment and economic support programs that have a refugee component in them. This could include, as a Brookings colleague, Kamal Krishi has written about, trade concessions programs with, for example, Turkey on specific sectors that Syrians work in. It also needs to include expanded legal pathways. So the US and EU following through, and other countries, for including the Gulf, following through on both refugee resettlement promises as well as non-refugee labor visa pathways, which could really be helpful, I think, for many of the Syrians who are displaced across the region right now.
Thank you, Reva. Fuad, so Reva also kind of built on some of the initial ideas that Marissa was presenting about different alternative policies and priorities that countries should put in place. I invite you first to maybe build on those on the stream of conversation that's happening in terms of maybe looking at what kind of institutional reforms may be necessary or other things that should change in the future, as well as invite you to kind of revisit any of the issues or comments in the Q&A that you think you would like to address.
Well, thank you. I mean, one of the questions, the Q&A is about the, asking if the panelists can put like a top 3 solution, though Marissa and Reva mentioned many, actually not only top 3, but also I think that also being that we're here to put like a sort of the top 3 could be quite tricky because, these issues needs like a more and more conversation and discussion. Anyway, but I'll try to do my best in that. One of the issues that thinking about is that in addition,
I think we lost Fuad briefly. Just let's give it 10 seconds. Hopefully it'll unfreeze. Fuad, if you're listening, we lost you in terms of you. Right now you're frozen. Okay, so I think we'll come back to him. Hopefully he unfreezes or reboots. We're nearing the end of the webinar, and I feel a bit guilty. It's a very important topic and very difficult questions, and I've been on the sending end of these questions, and you've been the one struggling to deal with it. So, and to answer some of these difficult things. What I'd like to do is as a final round, very quickly, is to see if Fuad's back. Fuad? Not yet. Okay. Okay. So, what is one key takeaway that you would like the participants maybe to take away from the conversation today, like a main point that you want to get across? Alternatively, if you had a magic wand, going back to Marissa's earlier point, and you could be aspirational about a policy change or something, what would that be in terms of something that you would like to see happen in the future? So, Marissa? You're muted, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Nader. So I think in the short term, I would say, and going back to Reva's comments earlier about all these different conferences and the pledges, in many cases, those pledges don't come through. And I think in the short term, if there's one thing that absolutely must happen is for these, donor pledges to come through and to address the basic humanitarian needs beyond just looking at the more medium and long term. And I want to reiterate the point that Reva also highlighted in terms of really trying to focus on long-term, a more long-term approach, particularly when it comes to the socioeconomic conditions. And a lot of it has to do with conversations with multiple stakeholders on the ground, including refugees themselves, IDPs themselves, the local community, and one thing not to forget is that local host communities in many of these areas have their own challenges. And if we want to, going back to the prevention thinking, want to sort of prevent some of these tensions to continue to rise, interventions have to keep in mind also addressing some of the needs of the host communities because of the additional pressures that they have to face. And I leave it there. I wish I have more to add, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Fuad, I'm going to come back to you at the end to wrap it up and state your three main points. I'm just going to turn very quickly.
And sorry for losing the connection. I don't know. One issue is the need of having like a regional approach more than individual country approach. Syria is a big example about having Syrians mainly in the three neighboring countries, and still we have a different individual countries to address their own needs. I think we need to have now more and more, sort of regional approach rather than, focusing on the national. Second one, definitely, and I strongly support the issue of Marissa, though could be ideal about prevention. I think we need to. Two opportunities happened in the last few months about, the issue of how to address or mitigate the consequences. One is about reconnecting or bringing Assad. Instead of putting like strong conditions about that, what they did actually, it's nothing, just mild issues about the issue of drugs and Captagon, and nothing about refugees, nothing about displacement, nothing about political reform. I think it was an opportunity. I mean, again, lost it. The second opportunity is, again, what happened, or the second example of what happened in Sudan. And, we saw something that could be good, flourishing, to be as a good example. Then the war, I mean, they let the war, erupt. So I think maybe in the future, hopefully, addressing these issues by getting the opportunities, maybe this could be a lesson learned, big lesson learned. So this is about the international engagement about that. A third issue is, again, I don't want to, we need to think about it not in silos. Refugees, stateless, IDPs, I mean, people on the move, all these issues. I think this is a major issue. I mean, coming back, climate change, refugees also. So we have something, happen about people on the move, people moving for the same reason that they did it thousand years ago. We need to think about that definitely in a different way. And revisiting, redefining that is not an intellectual exercise. It is very important, and the implication for that will be something to have a new vision about displacement. And I will stop here.
Reva, the final word is yours. Same question, key takeaway or kind of an aspiration that you might have?
Yeah, thank you, Nader. And I do want to just take this time to focus on Sudan, because we did say talk about it a bit, but I think, we're in the early days of that response. There's been a lot of displacement from Sudan in the past, and what we're seeing in Egypt, what we're seeing in Chad, what we're seeing in other neighboring countries, that Sudanese and returning refugees, for example, to South Sudan, people who had fled from South Sudan to Sudan and then are now going back to South Sudan, is that early action is key. Getting in aid mechanisms, getting in cross-border support, and early starts on working towards a political solution in Sudan are all extremely key. And what we do now will shape the future of the refugee response in these countries. So, for example, I would say that, when we're thinking about these responses, every neighboring country of Sudan right now is facing, severe environmental challenges, severe challenges as a result of climate change, and their populations, as Marissa mentioned, in the Syria case, are facing very high levels of poverty and economic and livelihood destruction as a result of climate change and water scarcity in these areas. And you're already seeing tensions come up between Egyptians and the Sudanese around water, and them blaming them for taking the water away. This is a reference, to the dam construction on the Nile River and supporting Ethiopia in this. So what we need to do now is make sure that we're putting in place measures that support both refugees arriving in these countries and host communities, that build on civil society efforts. And that was the same thing in the early days of the Syria response. You had local civil society, mayors on the border areas of Syria and neighbor countries being the first responders, and them being, effectively displaced by international efforts. But instead, I really think we should be building on those efforts instead here. And I think what we do now will shape the future of the response over the next year, hopefully not 5-10 years, but as history has indicated, more likely than not, unfortunately.
Thank you, Reva. Thank you, Fuad, Marissa, Reva, so much for a very rich and engaging discussion on this very difficult but yet important and urgent issue. I'd like to thank you so much, and hopefully we can really continue the conversation and to think about these issues. And I look forward to continuing discussing them with you in the days and weeks to come. Thanks to the Islam Faris Institute for joining us and hosting this important webinar. And finally, to the audience and participants and the people who asked these important questions. And hope to see you again at another one of our events. Stay safe and best wishes. Thank you all.